Hi guys, welcome back aboard good old Athena. In this week's video it is finally time to modify our Starlink installation to run off of DC rather than AC, and also swap out the default Starlink router with a Peplink Max BR1 Pro. Let's go ahead and move that task into doing. This week we also finally have the parts for the anchor roller fix. I also want to epoxy, for a lack of a better word, our sub countertop in the galley, and we have a giant anode we need to replace. My name is Mess, this is my wife Ava. I've spent the last 5 years on a somewhat extensive refit of our 1987 Warrior 38 named Athena. That was a DIY fun-packed adventure complete with a very extensive osmosis treatment, building a new rudder using vacuum infusion, rebuilding the entire deck, gutting and subsequently rebuilding most of the interior, painting the top sides, and a ton of other projects. The summer of 2021 we started cruising full time. Now we're finally ready to begin our adventure. Let's start with what I think is going to be the quickest and easiest job this week, and that is the fix for the bow roller so we can get the chain and the anchor back aboard the boat. We used to have this fancy tilting thing here be a part of our bow roller, but it got all kinds of beat up and warped. As a result, this little rod in here got bent, so this stopped turning, and yeah, as you can see, it's all just chewed up. Once we're back in the US, I can hopefully borrow somebody's metal workshop and make a beefier, stronger version of this. But until we're back in the US, we need a temporary fix of sorts. As soon as we leave Trinidad, we're going to be living at anchor for at least the next 6 months, so we desperately need a sturdy and trustworthy anchoring setup. So I drew up this little guy here. He is going to be the replacement for the fancy swiveling doodad. I think the primary reason the fancy setup here failed is the 8mm rod here. It's just maybe a little bit undersized, and it's bent and kept this doohickey from turning. For the temporary setup, we're going to do away with the fancy tilting guy and just go directly onto this 12mm rod. This should be much stronger than this. I made a drawing and gave that to a local machine shop along with, I think it was about $120 US, and yeah, it took them a little bit longer than expected, but finally yesterday I got my part. And as you can see, I've kept the groove that we had in the original part also. This is dimensioned so that it fits the links on our 10mm chain, so the chain can come up without wobbling from side to side. And I don't know, maybe this also helps straighten up the chain a little bit for the gypsy on the windlass, but I don't think so. But I think it's a nice design feature. The machine shop did mess up a little bit. This is not perfectly centered, but that doesn't really matter so much. The overall is exactly where it needs to be, so hopefully this fits. After a tiny bit of wiggling and tightening the nuts, enough for the nylock to engage, but not enough for them to squeeze the sides, it seems like everything worked out really well. I loaded up the chain and tied the blue Dyneema line that connects the end of the chain to the boat. The purpose of the Dyneema line is to give us an easy way of releasing the chain in case we need to, but at the same time not to be able to accidentally drop the chain overboard. The one downside to a wireless remote is that it's easy to forget inside of the boat. With the breaker flipped and the remote in hand, bringing up the chain was easy, and as you might be able to see here, the bow roller fix rotates freely with the chain. We have 100 meters of chain, and for that to fit nicely in the chain locker, I need to distribute the first bit of it evenly in the chain locker. That's not a big deal, but this is where I found a little surprise. Ta-da! Ants. Hundreds and hundreds of ants. In a rather poor real estate investment, the ants apparently decided to move up into our piled up chain. To not get hundreds of new pets aboard the boat, I rinsed off the chain with a bit of water to get rid of the unwelcomed guest. I didn't bother putting the chain on a pallet because I thought we were only going to be a few days and then I'd have the part from the machine shop. Lesson learned. Put the chain on a pallet the next time. The really good news is that my little cruiser's fix here seems to be working perfectly fine. There is one downside to it, however, and that's the fact that we need to lash down the anchor once it's up before we get underway. Whereas with the old fancy doohickey here, the anchor was kind of held in place. So yeah, that is a little bit of a downside. But this is a temporary fix, and now I have a fun metal working project to look forward to in the US. It's getting a little bit late in the day, but there's one more quick job I hope we can check off the to-do list. We've got this big sink anode here on the starboard side of the hull. Hi, buddy. Hi. What are you doing? Hi. Oh, yeah, that's a good boy. That's a good boy. It's this guy right here, and I've got his replacement here. Now, there's not really too much to say about this guy. He is just a sink anode. Theoretically, I could have replaced this guy in the water, but he is secured to the boat with basically some threaded rod. And I was a little bit afraid if I start messing around with the nuts that I might cause some kind of leak or something. Old crusty guy, new shiny guy. Now, we've been sailing around with this guy since we left Denmark. I just wanted to make sure that we could replace it in case we needed to. But yeah, he weighs a fair bit, so it'll be nice to get it out of the boat. That was a delightfully easy job. Now let's just check under the cabin sole to make sure everything still looks okay. I haven't been in here for the last, I don't know, something like 6 months, so I don't know what kind of mess we're gonna encounter. Oh wow, that looks surprisingly clean. These are what's holding the anode to the boat, and nothing has turned. Everything looks perfect. We're about 6.5 minutes into the video and we can already close 2 tasks. Of course, that is because they were smaller tasks, but still, it feels really good. Now, next up, let's deal with the Starlink task. Just a quick word of caution here. I'm shooting this video a few weeks before it'll go live on YouTube, and just last night, Starlink announced their new standard non-articulating dish. Now, the dish we have here aboard Athena, the one I'm going to be converting to DC, is the older version, the articulating standard rectangular dish. For the new dish, the process of converting it to DC might be slightly different. At least from the photos I've seen so far, it looks like it has a slightly different plug, and also the power consumption for this new dish should be slightly higher. So just keep that in mind. I installed Starlink back in the late summer of 2022 in France. And since then, it's been nothing short of amazing. We had internet on the Atlantic crossing. We have had internet everywhere we've gone, with the one exception of Cape Verde, but I think that was just because it wasn't supported at that point in time. Currently, we're running our Starlink off of our 5000 watt inverter, but we only really need that inverter for stuff like cooking here in the galley, filling dive tanks, making water, doing laundry, stuff like that. And it would be really nice to be able to turn off the inverter when we're not doing any of those activities. Fortunately, it is now easier than ever to convert your Starlink to DC. You actually don't even have to cut the proprietary Starlink cable and crimp on an RJ45 connector anymore. So yeah, easier than ever. There are a couple of really good ways of converting to DC. I will showcase one here. I'll be using a Dishy Dually and one of these Yaosheng converters to go from the proprietary Starlink plug to a standard RJ45 connection. Dishy Dually is a custom designed PoE injector. It's made specifically for Starlink, and it's made specifically for the version of the dish that we have. Now, this is needed because normally the dish is powered off of the Starlink router, but we're going to be replacing that, hence the Dishy Dually. The converter to go from the annoying proprietary Starlink cable to a standard RJ45 cable is from a company called Yaosheng, I believe. They also make a custom PoE injector, but their PoE injector is for 48 volts only. The Dishy Dually, on the other hand, supports 12 and 24 volts directly, and it has another couple of cool little features. The case here is an optional extra. If you have a 3D printer, I'm sure there are some great ones out there that you can just print, but this label here is kind of nice. As you can see here, you can do some remote shutdowns. This lists router, for instance. I believe that's because the router port on the Dishy Dually actually supports PoE, so provided your router supports power over Ethernet, you can power the router that way. The router I'll be using does not support that feature. And then also you have a little 48 volts auxiliary output in case you need it. The DishyDually PCB has a couple of pins for configuring it. There's one here and one up here. The one down here is used for setting the system voltage. That tells the DishyDually if it's on a 12 or 24 volt nominal system. That way it can prevent itself from over discharging the system. It looks like by default it comes set up for a 12 volt system, so we need to move that over to this side to tell it it's going to be on 24 volts. The other pin up here is for configuring the PoE on the router port, but seeing as our router doesn't support PoE, it's very important that we remove this jumper. Please excuse the rusty pair of pliers here, but that happens on a boat. In terms of selecting the voltage here, really our BMS gives us the same protection this will, but we might as well set it up correctly. So now the Dually is set up for a 24 volt system. I've installed the PCB in the little case, and I actually think this is a really nice little case. Now where I'm going to be installing all of this is a little bit cramped, so it might be easier to show you how everything is going to go together here on the table instead of crawling around on the floor later. The Dishy gets power directly from our distribution panel. There is an RJ45 cable that goes up to the new router and another RJ45 cable that goes to the Yaosheng adapter. The converter doohickey here is completely optional. You could just cut the proprietary Starlink cable and crimp on an RJ45 connection, and indeed DishyDually provides great instructions for doing just that. But as soon as you've done that, you can no longer easily connect to the standard Starlink router. And that is the very reason why I have decided to go with the little converter here. I think this guy is like $35 US on Amazon. But in case we ever need to, we can easily unplug from this guy and plug directly back into the Starlink router. I think that's worth it. In terms of the router, I've chosen to go with a Peplink, or nowadays I believe it's Pepwave, Max BR1 Pro. Now there are two different versions available of this router. There is a 5G version and then there's also an LTE or 4G version. The 5G modem that's inside of this little guy is, at least from what I've been able to read, a little bit on the older side. That combined with the fact that the areas we're going to be in won't really have a lot of 5G coverage, and also the 4G version is a little bit cheaper. I saved about $300 by going with the 4G version, so yeah, we chose to not go with the high-end one. There are a couple of reasons why I decided to go with this router. For one, Peplink or Pepwave has a really great reputation, and after the ordeal that was the yacht router, I just really want something that just works. And also, we are able to power this router directly off of 12 or 24 volts. The Max BR1 Pro has a bunch of other cool features, but I think that is going to be a story for another time. By going with something like this, we also, of course, have the option of switching to cellular internet. Now, Starlink is awesome, especially in remote places or in places where cellular data is very expensive, like, for instance, a lot of the Caribbean. But as soon as we get to the US, it would be nice to be able to switch back to cellular data. It's going to be a lot cheaper for us, and yeah, it's a nice option to have. I'm going to install the router and the DishyDually here underneath our nav station. That way it's super easy for me to swap out SIM cards if we ever need to do that. And on a little side note, I'm very excited to be able to remove the Starlink router for this area here behind our distribution panel, because that thing does seem to put out quite a bit of heat. The area under the nav station is also home to our NAS and a bit of a shameful wiring mess. I ran power to both the Dually and the router straight from our distribution panel and got both of the doohickeys screwed in place. Now keep in mind you can't really see any of this stuff unless you're kneeling down next to the nav station. It took a couple of tries, but I managed to make a custom length Ethernet cable. Much like the pliers I showed you earlier, my crimping tool has gotten a bit rusty and is no longer super reliable. I don't have the official DC power cord for the router, but I figured I could just cut the wall adapter off the one that came with the router. I am a tiny bit paranoid by nature, so I decided to check the polarity of the plug. After a little bit of head scratching, it turns out that was a good thing. In this cable, red is positive and white is negative. Black is not needed. Delightful. I soldered the cable onto the wires I ran earlier and slid on a bit of heat shrink. To be able to turn on and off the Dually and the router independently, I added two new breakers to our distribution panel. After having powered on the router and logged into the web interface, I powered on Starlink, and within a few seconds the web interface said connected. I yet again had a glorious internet and also apparently a very dirty screen. Updating the router firmware seemed like a good next step and was super easy. After that I found a guide, and I'll include a link for this in the description, on how to get the Starlink app to work with the new router. And just like that, I had blazing fast internet and a working Starlink app, including the network statistics and also the cool little sleep feature. That might be a handy way for us to save a bit of power at night. The underside of the nav station still looks a little bit messy, but it's not a big deal. I think I'll leave it like this until I'm 100% sure everything works. That means we can now close the Starlink task here and move on to the final task, which is the epoxy sub counter. This piece of plywood here in the galley is what I'm referring to as the sub countertop. I just don't know what to call it. But 2 years ago, when we were leaving Denmark, we were very pressed for time in getting the boat ready. And as a result, a few corners were cut. Like for instance, I didn't seal this surface with epoxy, and I also didn't seal the underside of our countertop. Over the last couple of years, we've developed a small leak from the sink, as you might be able to tell by the black mold on here. Now that has left us with a delightfully warped countertop, but thankfully no water damage to the rest of the galley yet. I'm waiting for a quote to see what a new Korean countertop would cost here in Trinidad, but it may be a better solution for us to just wait 6 months until we're in the US. I'm assuming prices are going to be better there, and also the selection is probably going to be a little bit bigger. But yeah, we could easily continue using that countertop, but I definitely want to make sure I get the galley sealed up, so if or when we start getting a leak again, we don't end up with water damage in the galley. To seal the wood, a bit of epoxy is going to be an excellent choice. About 3 coats should do it. But for me to be able to do a good job, of course, I have to clean the surface here. I also want to remove the sink and the faucet so we can get every little bit of wood thoroughly sealed. After having turned off the pump for the pressurized water, the faucet came out without much trouble. The same cannot be said for the plumbing for the sink. I tried applying heat, but in the end I had to cut the hose. Removing the sealant around the sink was a breeze with my trusty scraper. Now it is at this point I realized that my memory must have failed me. I very clearly had already sealed the plywood with epoxy before leaving Denmark. With everything already removed, I decided to just continue as planned with a light sanding to key the surface. For any kind of sanding job inside of the boat, I really wish I had a vacuum I could hook up to my sander. That is definitely on my wish list for a potentially bigger boat. This is a bit of a weird situation. I can confidently say that the only thing worse than half-assing a job because you're out of time is thinking you half-assed a job and then going back to fix it, and turns out it wasn't really half-assed anyways. I figured now that I've gone through the trouble of removing the sink and the faucet, I might as well get a bit of extra epoxy on here, and hopefully I won't forget about that again. I'll apply 2 coats wet on tacky, that way we don't have to do any kind of sanding in between the 2 coats. I had some foam rollers, and those are great for putting down a super smooth surface. But here, I don't care so much about the smoothness, I just care about layer thickness, that it's enough to actually seal up the plywood. So we'll just use a giant brush instead. The second coat should be ready to go on later tonight, but when I do that, there's going to be no visual change here that I can show you, so I'll end this week's video here. In next week's video, I should be ready to make the final decision on whether or not we're going to upgrade to Korean here in Trinidad, or if we're going to postpone that until we get to the US. Now, with that decision out of the way, hopefully we can get some kind of countertop back in the galley, and then we can install this guy, our fancy new water purifying doohickey. So yeah, next week should be a fun video. And on that cheerful note, I'll end this week's video here. I hope to see all of you guys back here aboard Athena next week for yet more oh glorious DIY fun. As always, feel free to leave a comment down below, and don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like. See you!